Hey everyone, today I've got another 6 rapid reviews just to try and help me catch up with the backlog of reviews that I need to get through, and because I've got so many new games to cover and I just do not have the time to give all these games a comprehensive review. And before I get into these games, I want to give a shout out to the show's sponsor, KIENDA.co.uk, who are my go-to online retailer in the UK, so be sure to check out their website and even use my discount code in the show notes to get 5% off your first order. But without further ado, let's get into the game. So the first one here is Aladdin's Dragons, which is this is actually the card game version to the original board game, and I think there's very little differences between the two. This is a standard little worker placement game, as you are basically almost blind bidding for these different gems, and then you're using those gems to bribe these guards and then get these victory points, which will give you little abilities as well as you go. For me, the game felt a little bit dated, it felt a bit clunky, and ultimately not very satisfying or fun. I just feel like there's way better worker placement games out there, and I think that, if anything, the best thing about this game is that it is pretty much a full worker placement game, but in a tiny little box. Didn't really get much from this one. I found it quite forgettable, and not really worth the time or effort it takes. So, sorry, it's not in tremendous detail there, but I wasn't very inspired by Aladdin's Dragons, and I give that one probably around a 4 out of 10. Next up, I have a more recent game with Lost Kingdoms, Pangaea in Pieces. So this was actually a game that only came out last year, I believe, and it has a lovely visual design of it. You know, there's dinosaurs. Really like the visuals, and this is an area majority tile placement game as you're building up this map of islands, of water, and you also have your own kind of species of dinosaurs that you're spreading out the map. You have almost like an action point system. As you're moving dinosaurs around, you can breed them, and you can even slide these tiles to create new islands or divide them up, etc. So I generally do quite like the idea and concept of this, but I did find it a bit too abstract for my personal taste. You could clearly see what everything could do at all times, and there was no real moments of, standout moments or anything like that. I also thought that you were a bit too subject to the tile draws, because often you would draw these tiles and it would just be a big kind of, area of water, and you can't really do much with that. You can never score points based on water anyway. And it was a bit too slow and plodding to move things around. I also found that I tended to do quite well in this game just by kind of camping on one island and winning that one and just expanding to it, which was not terribly exciting. Also, there was a bunch of different tiles that had different symbols on them, and a lot of those would prevent you from spawning new pieces, which was a big part of the game. So it felt like you were always backed into a corner and couldn't really do much with your turns. So I thought the game was certainly lacking, nothing to write home about, and there's just so many good tile placement games and so many good area majority games that this one does not even stand close to most of them. So yeah, this one's quite a hard avoid for me. That is Lost Kingdoms. Probably give that one around a 4 out of 10. Next up, we have a much quicker game with Treelings. So this is a game where you are basically trying to build up these columns of cards, and you have, I think it's 5 or 6 different colours. And all you're doing is you're drafting from this, an open draft from this pool of cards. You either draft, I think it's all the cards with one type, or you can draft all the cards of one type. So, and then you've got to add them to their respective columns. And the idea is that your tallest columns are going to score. However, if they overshadow one next to it, then that one's not going to score. And that also wraps around to the other players. So if you had a really high column here and your opponent had a higher one, then even your high column isn't going to score. So that was quite a cool concept, and the interaction was relatively interesting. However, I thought the game was beyond tactical. It was so unpredictable to work out what you wanted to do, because the game could end at any minute. You didn't know what to take. Should I keep adding to this one? Should I spread them out evenly? And all of a sudden that game will end and you just are left with what you've got. And there was no real planning for that. So again, I thought that was a bit annoying. There's nothing really interesting that goes on here other than the way that you interact with your opponents. And ultimately it was just a bit forgettable and a bit generic, and just didn't really do anything new or fun. So that is Treelings, another game that I'll probably give around a 4 out of 10. Next up, we have Ominoes, or Ominoes, I'm not quite sure how you pronounce this one. This is a dice rolling abstract game that I was actually pretty intrigued by. So this one, you are essentially, you have this big grid or big board in the middle of the table, and you are rolling dice, and you have a symbol basically associated to you, and you want to be moving these dice around after rolling them to connect with each other and build, I think, a group of them up, because you get points accordingly. You can use dice as blockers. There are some other pieces that let you flip things. And for an abstract game, I was a bit underwhelmed by the fact that it was so luck dependent. There'd be some times where you just would not roll your symbol and there wasn't much you could do, and it was always pretty obvious what you had to do by moving people's pieces away from theirs and moving yours towards you. So I thought the lack of decisions here was quite overwhelming. Nothing really interesting to ponder over, and for an abstract game you definitely do need those crunchy decisions. I think for a real young family or children, this one could be somewhat enjoyable. You could get something from it, but at this stage, it really didn't do anything for me at all. So that is Ominoes, another game I'd probably give a 4 or a 5 out of 10 to. Penultimately, I have Spike. So Spike, I think, is a relatively successful train game. We're talking a medium-light train game, route building style, as you'd probably expect. As basically you are going to build a route on this big board here by placing these really fiddly, cheap-feeling plastic pieces on the board. And these get knocked everywhere. They're very hard to move around. And yeah, just a horrible piece to play with. And then you're basically moving your train up these routes, trying to connect to these cities, and when you build these cities, sometimes you get more money based on this supply and demand marker here, which was a little bit too swingy for me. Sometimes you just happen to be next to the town that had the highest value, and you get a lot of points that way. And I really did like or dislike the fact that you had to spend a whole turn to move your train from these cities onto this track so that you would get this passive movement point. It just felt very slow, long, drawn out and tedious. And basically on top of that, you're trying to connect these cities to cities based on different commodities you were assigned at the start of the game. It just felt like with a glance of the game board from the get-go, you could see exactly what you needed to do, what you were going to do, and then the rest of the game would just catch up with you. There was no real tactical decisions that you needed to overcome. The whole game was just laid out in front of you, and it was just a matter of just twiddling your fingers, waiting for it to resolve itself and hoping you got the most points. So I thought this was really disappointing, actually. I think mechanically it's fine, but there did need to be some events or something to spice up the gameplay, because it was just too predictable on what was going to happen and how the game was going to play out, and the production is pretty damn awful. So yeah, the Spike was sadly a bit of a letdown for me, and I'll probably give that one around a 5 out of 10. And the final game I'm talking about on this episode is Steam Time. This is actually a Really Good Dawn design, who's one of my favourite designers. Played very few of his games that I haven't enjoyed, and this one I did enjoy. I thought it was absolutely fine. It's a medium weight worker placement engine building style game where you are placing workers based on this action strip system, where you would actually have to start from the bottom and move up. You couldn't just teleport here and then move backwards. You had to be very careful about how you paced yourself. So it did have that almost time track system. And the level of engine building was okay in this game, as you'd collect these gems and build up your ability to do certain things. However, to get a big chunk of points, you'd have to forsake those gems and weaken your engine. And that idea of that stop and start engine wasn't quite as enjoyable to me as I thought it would be. I prefer to, once you've got something, you've got it for the rest of the game, rather than having to give it up and go back to being weak. So that was a bit annoying, and ultimately for me, a big issue for this game was how unfriendly it is to colourblind gamers. Myself and my brother are both colourblind, and we struggled immensely with some of the colours of these gems and things. So yeah, it was a big disappointment in terms of that, and it was almost unplayable for it. But mechanically, the game works absolutely fine. There's quite a lot going on here, actually, and some of the engines were relatively satisfying. It was just a shame that they were all so temporary. But yeah, a decent design, just one that wasn't really going to cry out to get played anymore. And I'd give this one probably around a a 5.5 to a 6 out of 10. So some promise, and I think some people would enjoy it, but not quite good enough to stick around in my own collection. So that is Steam Time. So there we go. Those are 6 rapid reviews there. Hopefully the video has been somewhat useful for you. And apologies I didn't give any of these games a comprehensive review. If you were waiting for that, I just simply do not have the time. So there we go. If you have enjoyed the video, please hit like and subscribe to the channel, and check out my other videos too. And for everyone else, I'll see you next time on Chairman of the Board. Bye bye.